Of course, not all disasters are foreseeable or avoidable. There is obviously a limit to what we can do to prevent the onset of disasters, but we can certainly minimise the extent of the loss, and that is proven. It is proven on the basis of experience. For instance, dealing with the issues of floods. Flood mitigation works in Lismore illustrate the return to investment in mitigation and prevention. In 2005, after completing a $19 million levy, Lismore experienced a 1 in 10 year flood. The levy saved about $15 million in recovery costs on that occasion alone, and also played an integral part in minimising flooding in Lismore in subsequent years. Similarly, at Gawler in South Australia, the construction of a flood control dam and associated works cost some $20 million, and it presents significant savings in a region which floods on average every 10 years. In November 2005, flooding in nearby Virginia and surrounds resulted in widespread damage to homes, businesses and infrastructure, with agricultural losses alone estimated to be about $40 million. Yet even with the combined efforts of all levels of government and the private sector, our current spending on disaster mitigation activities is only a small portion of the cost of rebuilding after events, but specifically after this summer's events. We would not accept that situation, as I've said, in respect to our preventive capability in counter-terrorism, in the counter-terrorism area, for instance, and we should not accept that limitation on our capability in respect to the emergency management area. There is no question that as a nation we need to find ways to increase our collective investment in dollars, in time and effort in these planning, organisational and mitigation aspects. And we need to look at the breadth of action required beyond simply our emergency response capability. We see that many of these initiatives extend far beyond the capability of our emergency responders. For instance, it involves more detailed thought and analysis of our urban and rural land planning, the creation and enforcement of appropriate standards and building codes, the examination of appropriate development approval processes, indeed cooperation at all levels of government. And it also involves the way in which individuals and governments address the risk. All levels of government are looking at many of these issues, as well as the issue of flood mapping, for instance, capability development, emergency warnings, volunteer issues as the community ages, that is a particularly significant issue, broader community engagement, risk assessment, communication in a crisis, and critical infrastructure protection, obviously. Governments certainly do not have a monopoly or knowledge of ideas in the field. It's open to organisations such as ASPI to contribute to ongoing public debate. You do that, and I thank you for it. You are performing a valuable public service in evoking public debate, and the debate that you evoke inevitably has its own influence and contribution on the development of broader government policy. But ultimately, whichever paths we choose will involve difficult choices and some hard decisions, particularly in this age of fiscal responsibility. But in this area in particular, I can tell you that the old adage, being penny wise and pound foolish, is very much relevant. In some cases, I believe to achieve long-term savings, but more significantly to prevent loss of life and injury in the future, it is necessary to require governments and businesses to spend more money up front to make those long-term savings, to rebuild our infrastructure, not just the way it was before, but in a different way so that it's able to withstand future disasters, referred to obviously in the natural disaster relief and recovery arrangements, but more broadly through the community as betterment, but that goes to the heart of building disaster resilience, and that is a dialogue that clearly we are having with the Queensland Government in particular, with the massive infrastructure build that is taking place now, and there is tremendous cooperation and acknowledgement of that need, but it is unquestionably going to be a challenge for governments at all levels as we strive to do that and do that effectively. In terms of the need for all governments to work together that I've referred to, there has been considerable advance in recent months. The Council of Australian Governments signed off on the National Strategy for Disaster Resilience. That strategy sets out the priorities of all Australian governments for building disaster resilient communities across Australia. It's the first step in a long-term process to develop sustained behavioural change. This will require a concerted whole-of-government effort, as demonstrated by the importance that the Prime Minister and state and territory leaders have given to endorsing this strategy at last month's Council of Australian Government. It acknowledges precisely what I've said, that our capabilities aren't simply our response capabilities, they also involve other government responsibilities, such as significantly planning decisions, many of which are made at a local government level, building codes, Australian standards, and indeed strategies to develop community resilience, including communication and command and control strategies. Also, as part of that, and reference has been made to the contribution ASPI has made in respect to the topic of insurance, and at the last MCPEM, or the Ministerial Council of Emergency Management Ministers, I distributed, the day after it had been released, the report on insurance, which was taken on board by ministers to their respective departments. But disaster insurance and the challenges of ensuring that it is accessible, affordable and appropriate have featured strongly in public debate during this disaster season. We do know that the insurance does reduce the final financial impact on one party by spreading it across the broader community. Insurance coverage by individuals, small business and even governments is an effective way of addressing the risk that they can face from natural disasters. The government has recognised that there is a need to look more broadly at this issue through the review of the disaster insurance that was recently announced by my colleague, the Honourable Bill Shorten, the Shadow Treasurer. The review will concentrate on insurance arrangements for individuals and business for damage and loss associated with flood and other natural disasters, and ASPI indeed is facilitating in the next few weeks a roundtable with experts in the area and in respect to mitigation measures generally, so that we can feed the expert contribution into that review process. There are, of course, a range of models that governments around the world have adopted to address this issue. They are referred to in the ASPI report if anyone is interested, and I know a number of you will be. These include the United States National Flood Insurance Program and the United Kingdom's Statement of Principles on the provision of flood insurance, which aims to provide more affordable flood insurance for consumers through cooperation between the UK government and the insurance sector. And without ruling in anything or ruling out anything, as a politician does, certainly before there is a review, I won't be saying anything, on the other hand, that will limit our options, but to keep open the ways of examining ways in which other governments work with their citizens and indeed insurance providers to build their community's ability to bounce back from disasters, in summary, to be resilient. The government's disaster insurance review will also consider whether existing recovery funding arrangements should be supplemented by a natural disaster fund, such as that which has been in place in New Zealand over many decades and will certainly be called on in respect to Christchurch. One advantage of that, when I met with the New Zealand Minister, was the fact that there will be a substantial investment from that fund into the New Zealand economy as part of the recovery and restoration works at a time that the community greatly needs it. These sort of things are the sort of issues that we will be examining. The Prime Minister has said that the possibility of a natural disaster fund is a long-term conversation. The conversation is well underway, and the government looks forward to the report of the review, which is due later in the year. We are conscious also of the fact that we do not want to have at a central level a fund that is a disincentive to people taking their private initiative for their own moral responsibility to take out appropriate insurance coverage. All these things will very much be part of the debate. I can say that the government has also strengthened the natural disaster relief and recovery arrangements to ensure state and territory governments have adequate capital or insurance to fund the replacement and restoration of essential public infrastructure, and these measures were implemented following discussions with Senator Xenophon around the flood levy, and they reinforced the principle that the Commonwealth state arrangements are not designed to supplant or operate as a disincentive for insurance or other disaster mitigation. In effect, the natural disaster relief and recovery arrangements have become a de facto reinsurance scheme, and that was not intended and inappropriately being exercised at the current time. So we believe the Commonwealth should continue to provide financial assistance to the states and territories through that scheme, through the natural disaster relief and recovery arrangements, to ensure disaster affected communities receive the support and assistance that they need to rebuild. But given that the taxpayers of Australia effectively fund those recovery, not effectively, they do refund those recovery arrangements, we are entitled to ask governments at all levels to maximise their own insurance coverage, or where insurance is not practical and it is recognised that in some areas it will be impractical because of the expense and the risk of the particular piece of infrastructure that is nonetheless an essential piece of public infrastructure, that other funding arrangements should be put in place. And these are matters that we are prepared to discuss with the states.